when the KGB was assigned to monitor Raisa Gorbacheva. They could not have imagined that they would witness one of the most tense situations within the Kremlin walls. This was a story where not only the reputation of the head of state, but also the fate of the entire country was at stake. In one of the secret offices of the Lubyanka, a dossier marked Top Secret appeared. The cover contained only 2 letters, Object R. Inside was a photograph of a woman known to the whole world. It was Raisa Maximovna Gorbacheva, the First Lady of the Soviet Union, the wife of the General Secretary, and one of the most influential women in Kremlin history. Before her, the wives of general secretaries remained in the shadows. They appeared at official events, stood silently next to their husbands, and disappeared. Raisa changed these rules. She communicated with journalists, expressed her views, and met with world leaders. The West adored her, and the Soviet elite was in shock. In the narrow circles of the Central Committee, she was called the Iron Lady of the East. Ministers feared her more than Mikhail Gorbachev himself, who might shout and forget, whereas Raisa remembered everything and took her revenge elegantly. Careers crumbled after one glance from her, and appointments were cancelled after a brief conversation in the corridors. The old guard of the party realized that a new center of influence had appeared in the Kremlin, and this center wore French dresses and spoke 3 languages. Vasily Kuprianov, the Minister of Defense, once remarked with a phrase that later spread throughout Moscow: "We are ruled by a family circle, and the main one in it is not him." But the most alarming thing was not her influence on politics. The most terrible thing was that Raisa did not belong to Gorbachev. Everyone who observed them noticed this. He looked at her as if she were an icon, and she looked through him, as if he were transparent glass. There was such cold detachment in her gaze that even experienced diplomats felt awkward. In the mid-80s, the first rumors began to spread. Journalists from foreign publications noticed Raisa's strange behavior. She often deviated from diplomatic protocol, lingered in negotiations with translators, and showed particular attention to individuals in foreign delegations, as if trying to find someone. The protocol service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs began to receive unusual complaints. Raisa demanded changes of translators without explanation, refused scheduled meetings, and insisted on unplanned ones. Her routes became unpredictable, which caused concern for her security. Diplomats were bewildered, and then came the phone calls, short conversations in French from her office in the Kremlin. Technical services recorded calls to Paris, but the numbers were unavailable for listening. Someone was carefully covering their tracks. The KGB hesitated for a long time to start an operation against the wife of the General Secretary. But after the first hints about Raisa's personal life appeared in the foreign press, patience ran out. The stakes were too high. The reputation of the Soviet Union, the authority of the party, and most importantly, the stability of the system. A decision was made for round-the-clock surveillance of Raisa Gorbacheva, not for protection, but for control. Every step, call, and meeting had to be recorded and analyzed. The operation was codenamed Mirror. The main episodes of the investigation are based on archival documents, KGB operational reports, Western press publications, and testimonies of those close to the Gorbachev family. It was at this moment that a man entrusted with an important task entered the center of the invisible war. Colonel Anatoly Severov received his assignment on a Monday morning. He was 42 years old, and behind him were 15 years of work in intelligence and surveillance experience in 7 countries. However, he had never had such an assignment. Tailing the wife of the General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee was both daunting and intriguing. The dossier on Object R began with a standard biography. Raisa Maximovna Titarenko was born on January 19, 1932, in the village of Rubtsovsk, Altai Krai. She graduated with honors from the Faculty of Philosophy at Moscow State University and defended her candidate's dissertation in sociology. She met Mikhail Gorbachev at a student dance, but on the second page of the file, the oddities began. While studying at the university, Raisa received special attention from one of her professors, Arkady Vladimirovich Sokolov, from the Department of Logic and Methodology of Scientific Cognition. He was 20 years older than her and gave her books that could not be found in the library. He invited her for long conversations after seminars. The oddities intensified. Shortly after Raisa met Gorbachev, Sokolov unexpectedly transferred to Ural University without explanation or farewell. The dean's office said it was due to family circumstances, but there was no family listed in Sokolov's personal file. Severov studied the documents and understood that something didn't add up. Too many coincidences and sharp turns of fate. Especially strange was an entry in Raisa's university diary, made shortly before she met Gorbachev. Where they stare at me intently, I do not want to live. Operation Mirror began with the installation of listening devices in Raisa's Kremlin office. The technicians worked at night when she was at home. Microphones were placed in the telephone, desk, and even in the flower pots. The recording quality needed to be perfect. The first results appeared after a week. Raisa was indeed having strange telephone conversations, short phrases in French. The numbers could not be identified as the calls went through international switching with multiple routing. However, the content of the conversations was alarming. She spoke of meetings, places that only the heart knows, and that her current life was just a role she was playing. Very convincingly, but still just a role. External surveillance revealed an even stranger picture. Raisa began to regularly visit an apartment on the Garden Ring. Officially, it was the apartment of a former actress from the Sovremenic theater who had emigrated. Unofficially, it was a meeting place with an unknown middle-aged man. Agents recorded his arrival at 17:30. Tall, athletic build, in an expensive European-cut coat. His face was always hidden by a scarf or a raised collar. He never arrived in the same car and always left exactly 3 hours and 6 minutes later. Severov understood that he was dealing with a high-class professional, someone who knew how to operate under conditions of total surveillance and remain invisible. This was not a casual affair of the General Secretary's wife, but something much more serious and dangerous. Attempts to photograph the mysterious visitor constantly failed. Cameras malfunctioned at the crucial moment. Films turned out to be overexposed. Lenses fogged up with condensation, as if someone knew about the surveillance and skillfully blocked it. Over time, KGB archivists were brought into Operation Mirror. They were tasked with finding all information concerning Arkady Vladimirovich Sokolov, the former professor at Moscow State University. What they discovered forced a reassessment of the entire case. Sokolov was born in 1910 in Petersburg. His father was a minor customs official, his mother a housewife, a typical pre-revolutionary family. But then the oddities began. There was no mention of the Sokolov family in the Cheka archives during the Red Terror, as if they had disappeared. The next record of Arkady was dated 1932, a student of the Faculty of Philosophy at Moscow State University, an excellent student, a Komsomol member. But where he came from to Moscow, where he had spent the previous years, no one knew. Even his classmates described him as a man from nowhere. Smart, well-read, but completely closed off. After graduating from university, Sokolov stayed on to teach, led seminars on logic, and wrote articles on the methodology of scientific cognition. His colleagues respected him, but no one knew him well. He lived alone, befriended no one, and went on vacation to unknown places. A typical solitary Soviet intellectual. In the 50th year, an extraordinary student named Raisa Titarenko appeared in Arkady Sokolov's life. She was a bright and smart girl, with burning eyes and an indomitable thirst for knowledge. Under Raisa's influence, Sokolov seemed to find new energy. He began to give her additional assignments, recommend rare books, and invite her for long conversations after lectures. Raisa's classmates noticed how she changed thanks to these meetings. She became more confident and independent. She began to read French philosophers in the original and quote authors that other students had not even heard of, as if she were receiving some special education. Sokolov did not just teach her philosophy. He shaped her worldview, explaining how power is structured, how mechanisms of influence work, and how one can change the world while remaining in the shadows. Raisa listened to him attentively and wrote everything down in her personal diary. Archivists discovered many interesting moments in her notes. Arkady claimed that every person can become a point of application for historical forces, and sometimes the fate of entire nations depends on one right decision at the right moment. He believed that Raisa was destined for something more than an ordinary life. Especially mysterious was an entry made in May 1952, a few days before she met Mikhail Gorbachev. Arkady said that changes will happen soon, and a person will appear who will open the path to her destiny. But real life will begin later. A week after Raisa met Mikhail Gorbachev, Sokolov unexpectedly submitted an application for transfer to Sverdlovsk, without explanation or farewell to his beloved student. He simply packed his things and disappeared. At Ural University, he was remembered as a withdrawn person who gave lectures and avoided communication with colleagues. But the most interesting thing was discovered in the closed archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1964, Arkady Sokolov went on a business trip to France, supposedly to study European philosophy. But unofficially, no one knew who authorized this trip or why it was necessary. He did not return from France. The university received a telegram stating that Professor Sokolov had decided to stay in Paris to continue his scientific work. The Soviet consulate confirmed that citizen Sokolov had applied for political asylum. The case was closed, and the man disappeared from Soviet history. In the spring of 1986, Gorbachev and his wife traveled to Paris for negotiations with President Mitterrand. It was the first official visit of a Soviet leader to France in a long time. The Western press called it historic, but no one suspected how significant it would be for the Gorbachev family. On the French delegation was a translator named André Mallier, a 38-year-old specialist, fluent in Russian, with diplomatic experience working with Eastern European countries. He seemed too young for such a responsible position, but too experienced for his age. The KGB checked his biography before the visit and found nothing suspicious. Andrei was assigned as the personal translator for Raisa Gorbacheva. He was supposed to accompany her on the cultural program, translate conversations with French ladies, and assist in communicating with journalists. Routine diplomatic work. But from the first meeting, it was clear that something unusual was happening between them. Witnesses noted Raisa's strange reaction upon meeting Andrei. She froze, as if seeing a ghost, and stared at him for several seconds, without responding to his greeting. Then she sharply composed herself and began speaking French as fluently as if she had lived in Paris all her life. Andrei also looked flustered. Colleagues noticed that he turned pale every time Raisa addressed him directly. He kept his distance, but he never took his eyes off her. He translated without looking at his notepad, as if he knew her every word by heart before she even said it. On the evening of the second day of the visit, an incident occurred. Gorbachev was scheduled to dine with French politicians at the Grand Hotel restaurant. Raisa planned to attend, but an hour before dinner she complained of feeling unwell and stayed in her room. Andrei also did not appear at dinner, citing the need to remain available in case the First Lady needed assistance. The security service established that no one entered the room where Raisa Gorbacheva was, although she was indeed there. However, recordings from external surveillance cameras showed a strange picture. At 18:45, a man in a dark coat entered the hotel, skillfully avoiding the camera's field of vision, which failed to capture his face. He stayed in the hotel for exactly 1 hour and 42 minutes and disappeared into the Parisian streets at 20:27. After that, no one saw him. The next day, Andrei reported an urgent summons to the ministry and disappeared from the delegation. The KGB tried to identify the mysterious guest, but the French special services stated they had no information. The hotel cameras provided only blurry footage, and the staff remembered nothing, as if this man had never existed. The only evidence of the meeting was a note found by a maid in Raisa's room. The next day, a few lines in flawless French written in her hand said, "You know that he is not mine, he never was. He is a project, you are life. Tomorrow I must return to the role, but now I know the difference." The note was confiscated and sent to Moscow, where an expert analysis confirmed Raisa Gorbacheva's handwriting. Linguists, however, pointed out an oddity. The French in the note was too perfect, not the level she demonstrated in official communication, as if it was written by another person, or she was hiding her true knowledge of the language. André Mallier disappeared from diplomatic circles immediately after the Paris visit, officially transferring to work in a private company that no one could specify. His apartment in Paris was empty, and neighbors recalled that he moved out at night without warning anyone. After returning from Paris, Raisa changed, becoming more distant and thoughtful. Colleagues noted that she seemed to have withdrawn into herself, mechanically performing all protocol duties, as if a part of her soul had remained in France. After this visit, Operation Mirror moved to a new level. Surveillance of Raisa became round the clock. Every step she took was recorded and analyzed. It soon became clear that a fundamental change had occurred in her behavior. Raisa began regularly visiting apartment number 37 in Building 26 on the Garden Ring, which was officially vacant. Its owner, an actress from the Sovremenic Theater, Elena Krasnova, had left for Israel 6 months ago. Unofficially, the apartment continued to be used. Agents set up surveillance at the building's entrance. Raisa always arrived at the same time, at 17:05, went up to the 4th floor and opened the door with her own key, the origin of which remained a mystery. The lights in the apartment were not turned on, but movement could be seen behind the curtains. At 17:30, a tall man in an expensive coat and a scarf covering half his face would appear, confidently walking up the stairs, as if he had known this building for many years. He entered without knocking, meaning he was expected. The meetings lasted exactly 3 hours and 36 minutes, as if by an internal chronometer. At 20:36, Raisa would leave, descending slowly, pausing on the landings, as if she didn't want to return to reality. The man would leave the apartment 5 minutes after her, always taking different routes and means of transport, sometimes on foot through the courtyards, sometimes by metro or taxi. Tracking him was practically impossible. He moved like a professional intelligence officer. Attempts to enter the apartment were unsuccessful. The locks had been replaced with complex European systems, and installing listening devices was too risky. All that remained was to observe from the outside and try to understand what was happening. External signs still provided important clues. After each meeting with Raisa, something changed. The tension that was always visible on her face disappeared. An inner softness and calm appeared, as if she had returned home after a long journey. Gorbachev also noticed these changes. Colleagues noted that the General Secretary became more withdrawn and focused. At Politburo meetings, he joked less, and after the official part, he immediately went to his office, avoiding unnecessary conversations even with close associates. The breakthrough in the investigation came by chance. Raisa's assistant, Galina Petrovna, fell ill with the flu and asked a colleague to sort through the accumulated correspondence. Among the documents, they found 3 letters in French, written in Raisa's hand. They had not been sent. Perhaps they were drafts, but their content shocked even experienced KGB officers. In the letters, Raisa confessed that real life had only begun now, that before she had been playing an imposed role, and that there was a person who knows her true essence. The most alarming letter contained a phrase that sent shivers down the spine of everyone who read it. "You know that he is not mine. He never was. He is a project. You are life. I am ready to leave everything and go, but I understand the price will be too high, not just for me." Handwriting and style analysis was unequivocal. The letters were written by Raisa Gorbacheva in a state of strong emotional distress. Linguistic analysis revealed an oddity. The level of French proficiency significantly exceeded the one she demonstrated publicly. By the autumn of 1987, rumors of Raisa's strange behavior reached Gorbachev himself. Although no one dared to directly discuss his wife's personal life with him, hints and meaningful pauses in conversations did their job. Anatoly Lukyanov, the Central Committee Secretary for Personnel Issues, was the first to break. At a planning meeting, he cautiously remarked that the Western press was paying too much attention to the private life of the first family, and perhaps it would be worthwhile to limit Raisa Maximovna's public appearances. Gorbachev listened in silence, asked no questions, just nodded, and changed the subject. But those who knew him well noticed. Something new appeared in his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, but rather the weary understanding of a man who had long been expecting this conversation. At home, he became different. Raisa noticed how her husband avoided her gaze, how he found pretexts not to dine together, how he went into his office and did not come out until morning. A wall of silence grew between them, which neither dared to break. Mikhail Sergeyevich chose his usual strategy: not to ask, not to clarify, not to conflict. He simply distanced himself, deciding that some truths are better left unknown, some wounds better left untouched, some questions better left unasked. But inside, he was breaking. Colleagues noted that Gorbachev became sharper in work matters, less tolerant of criticism. At one Politburo meeting, he suddenly exploded over a triviality, yelled at the Minister of Trade, then abruptly fell silent and left. Strange entries appeared in the personal notebook he kept for notes, short phrases, more like attempts at self-analysis. When you love someone you don't know. When you live with someone who lives with another. If she leaves, I will be left only with the state. The most terrible thing for Gorbachev was not the infidelity itself, but its calculated nature. Raisa wasn't just meeting another man. She was leading a double life with the skill of an experienced intelligence officer. Every movement was carefully thought out. Every word weighed. Every emotion controlled. In his personal notes, he tried to understand when exactly he had lost his wife. Maybe the day she first smiled at Western journalists. Maybe when she started speaking French to him. Or maybe he never had her at all. Perhaps from the very beginning, Raisa belonged to someone else. Gorbachev made a decision that reflected him as a politician and as a man. He chose the state, chose the stability of the system. I chose silence because the truth would have been devastating not only for me personally, but for everything I was building. Perestroika, glasnost, new thinking. Everything would have collapsed under the weight of the scandal. But the price of silence was high. Gorbachev began to age before their eyes. Colleagues noticed how he would sometimes freeze, staring into space, how he forgot simple things, how he avoided appearing in public with his wife. The empire demanded sacrifices, and he sacrificed himself. Raisa understood that her husband knew, and continued to play the role of the loving wife. At official events, they looked like the perfect couple. He offered her his hand. She smiled. But at home, a desert of silence stretched between them, which neither of them could cross. In the spring of 1988, an incident occurred that nearly destroyed their fragile balance. Gorbachev accidentally walked into his wife's office while she was speaking on the phone in French. Raisa did not lose her composure, continued the conversation, looking her husband straight in the eye. He stood for a few seconds and left. That night, Mikhail Sergeyevich did not sleep, paced his office, drank tea, looked out the window at the Kremlin walls, and in the morning, wrote a phrase in his diary that explained their entire future life. In the autumn of 1989, an article appeared in the Parisian tabloid France Soir that caused a real stir even among experienced KGB officers. The headline was provocative enough to make many wary. Madame Gorbacheva and the Man with No Name. The author of the article hid under a pseudonym, but the information was so accurate that it was difficult to call it an accidental leak. The article described a tall man who was not listed on any official Soviet delegation, but constantly appeared in the same places as the First Lady of the USSR. The journalist claimed to have photographs taken in Paris, London, and Rome, which captured a special closeness between Raisa and the unknown man. The KGB immediately contacted French special services, but received an evasive answer that there was no data on such photographs in official archives. Unofficially, it became known that the material indeed existed, and someone very influential was preventing its publication. The France Soir article was just the beginning. A week later, similar materials appeared in the Italian and British press. The details varied, but the essence remained the same. The wife of the Soviet leader has a secret relationship with a mysterious man. The Western press was cautious in its wording, avoiding direct accusations of infidelity. But the hints of mysterious friendship and unusual meetings were obvious to everyone. Panic began in Moscow. The Kremlin press service worked in emergency mode, trying to prepare a denial. But how do you deny something that wasn't formally an accusation? Raisa continued her official duties, but now she had to endure the intense scrutiny of journalists. The shock came in December, when the editorial office of the German magazine Stern received a package with no return address. Inside was an audio cassette with a recording of a woman's voice, speaking French. Expert analysis confirmed the voice belonged to Raisa Gorbacheva. The cassette contained fragments of telephone conversations, short phrases that left little doubt about the nature of the relationship. "You are freedom for me. He is a prison. I am tired of playing the role of a happy wife. Soon everything will change and we can be together." Stern did not publish the recording in full, given the political risks, but information about its existence quickly spread among the leading media in Europe and America. In diplomatic circles, the scandal involving Gorbachev's wife was the only topic of discussion. The KGB launched an internal investigation, trying to find out how recordings of the First Lady's telephone conversations could have ended up in the Western press. Suspicion fell on several employees, but no evidence was found. The most alarming thing was the quality of the recordings. The sound was too clear for accidental eavesdropping. Someone had been recording Raisa's conversations using professional equipment, with access to the Kremlin's secure communication lines. Mikhail Gorbachev learned about the cassette from Alexander Yakovlev. He silently placed a folder with the transcription of the recordings on the table. Gorbachev read the documents, set them aside without a word, and changed the topic to economic issues. But that night, absolute silence reigned in the Gorbachev house. The husband and wife stopped communicating even on mundane topics, passing notes to each other through the servants. An abyss had opened between them that was impossible to bridge. There were 2 years left until the collapse of the USSR, and 2 years of silence between people who had once loved each other. August 1991. The Crimean dacha in Foros. Gorbachev is in isolation, cut off from Moscow and the world by the putschists. Next to him is his family, wife, daughter, granddaughter. But physical proximity only emphasized the emotional chasm between the spouses. Raisa behaved like a hostage, blaming not her captors for her situation, but the one who had brought her to this dangerous place. Her every glance said, "You have lost everything, the country, power, and me too." Gorbachev read these silent reproaches and understood. My wife is right. He really had lost everything. On the first day of forced isolation, Raisa unsuccessfully tried to establish contact with the outside world via the guard's satellite phone. The prohibition forced her to retreat to her bedroom, where she spent the whole day, surrounded by muffled sounds. Quiet sobs, talking to herself, or perhaps prayers for a swift end to this nightmare. Mikhail Sergeyevich sought ways to understand his wife, assuring her that they could survive the crisis, that their love was stronger than political storms, and that they were together. However, Raisa, silently looking out the window at the sea, uttered words that finally undermined his confidence. "You loved power, and I loved a person. Your love ended yesterday, mine, long ago." On the second day of the putsch, Raisa expressed fear that they might not return to Moscow alive, that the putschists were capable of anything. There was no fear in her voice, only a strange relief, as if the possibility of a tragic end freed her from the need to continue a game that had become unbearable. Mikhail watched as his wife methodically destroyed personal documents and photographs, tearing up letters she had kept in a secret box. Among the scraps, he noticed pages with French text and tried to read them, but Raisa snatched the sheets and threw them into the fireplace. On the night of August 19th to 20th, the couple spoke for the last time as husband and wife. Raisa sat by the window, looking at the stars over the Black Sea. Mikhail approached her and asked, "Can we still fix everything?" Her sad gaze made it clear. No, nothing can be changed now. When the news of the putsch's defeat arrived on the morning of August 21st, Raisa showed neither joy nor relief, simply nodded and began to pack. She knew that returning home did not mean returning to her former life. The flight to Moscow passed in complete silence. Mikhail looked out the window at his homeland, realizing that he was losing not only power, but also his family. Raisa sat opposite, immersed in reading French novels, not looking up. There was an abyss of misunderstanding between them that was impossible to bridge. After returning from Foros, everything changed. Mikhail became slow in his movements, unsure of his decisions. Raisa was demonstratively silent at official events, and the Western press wrote about a crisis in the Soviet leader's family, turning out to be right. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 became both the finale of the empire and their marriage. They continued to live in the same house, but it was the life of former allies who had lost trust in each other. Mikhail would later tell friends, "The empire collapsed, but I collapsed first." After his resignation in December 1991, the couple found themselves in a new reality. There were no more state dachas, government planes, or protocol duties. There were only the two of them in a Moscow apartment, facing a new life. With each new day, the silence became more oppressive. Raisa formally played the role of the former president's wife, accompanied her husband to rare official events, participated in interviews, and smiled for photographers. However, it was noticeable to those close to them that the fire in her eyes had gone out. Only the fatigue from the endless game remained. Mikhail Sergeyevich tried to rekindle their former relationship, gave her flowers, suggested trips, discussed plans. Raisa accepted these tokens of attention with polite gratitude, like a stranger accepting gifts from a persistent admirer. Outwardly, everything was proper, but inwardly, she remained distant. In 1993, they moved to a new apartment on Kosygin Street. Spacious rooms, high ceilings, and a view of Sparrow Hills. Raisa, with the meticulousness of an architect, took charge of decorating the home, thinking through every detail. The perfect interior for a family that no longer existed. They started a tradition of dining together at 1900, discussing the day's events and plans for tomorrow. Outwardly, a family idyll, but the conversations were markedly neutral. Weather, news, household issues. No personal topics, memories, or shared plans. Friends tried to reconcile them, invited them to visit, created romantic situations. The Gorbachevs played the role of a happy couple so convincingly that those around them believed in their well-being. But left alone, the masks came off, and the truth was revealed. Raisa spent more and more time outside the home, went to theaters, museums, met with friends. Sometimes went to her daughter's dacha and did not return for weeks. Mikhail Sergeyevich did not object, understanding that it was easier for her this way, and it was also easier for him to be alone. In 1995, an episode occurred that finally put everything in its place. Raisa found a note in her husband's jacket pocket with a woman's name and phone number. She didn't make a scene, didn't demand explanations, but simply placed the note on Mikhail Sergeyevich's desk. In the evening, he tried to explain, assuring her it was a misunderstanding and there was no one. Raisa listened calmly and uttered a phrase that put a full stop on their relationship. "I don't care. Everyone should have the right to happiness, even us." After that, they lived like neighbors in a communal apartment. Politely, correctly, without interfering with each other. Mikhail left for his foundation office in the morning and returned late in the evening. Raisa read, engaged in charity work, and met with journalists. Two parallel lives under one roof. In 1998, Raisa was diagnosed with leukemia. This news sounded like a sentence, but she accepted it with some relief, as if an honest way to end the long game had finally been found. A clinic in Berlin, June 1999. In ward number 317, Raisa Gorbacheva is battling leukemia, while her husband, Mikhail Sergeyevich, for the first time in many years, does not know what to say. He flew to Germany when it became clear that she could not be saved at home. And since then, he has been sitting beside her, holding her hand, and reading Russian classics aloud. Raisa listens silently, sometimes smiles, but her eyes remain empty. The medical staff notes in her chart, the patient shows no emotional attachment to her spouse. All conditions have been created for comfortable treatment. A private room with a view of the park, the best doctors in Europe, the latest medications. However, Raisa has stopped fighting, accepting the treatment as an inevitable procedure. Her eyes show detachment, as if she has already mentally said goodbye to life.